Before we begin, a quick reminder that the Victorian Railway was not just a marvel of steam and steel, it was also a surprisingly convenient place to be murdered. Locked compartments, no corridors, and absolutely no background checks on who sat across from you. In the stories ahead, we'll explore just how enthusiastically some Victorians took to combining first-class travel with blunt force trauma. There will be mystery, obsession, blood-stained upholstery, and the kind of decisions that make you wonder if a horse and cart was safer after all. If you enjoy drifting off to strange and unsettling stories from the past, hit that like button and subscribe for more delightfully drowsy disasters. This episode is part of our Victorian series, a cosy collection of bedtime stories exploring the most bizarre, baffling and beautifully packaged poisons of the 19th century. Tell us in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is, because there's something oddly soothing about falling asleep to the sound of mystery, mayhem and a softly crackling fire. So settle in, check your pockets, and maybe don't fall asleep. This train has a rather unfortunate history of arriving with fewer passengers than it left with. You're a middle-class Victorian gentleman with a pocket watch, a firm belief in timetables, and exactly zero survival instincts. You've just boarded the 6:15 to Self-Delusion, also known as the North London Railway first-class compartment, because of course it's first class. You wouldn't be caught dead in second. That, unfortunately, is about to become ironic. You settle into your plush seat, adjusted just so for spinal superiority, and pull out your evening paper. Not to read, of course, you just want people to know you're literate. The compartment smells faintly of pipe smoke, mothballs, and whatever the previous occupant was sweating about. Still, the doors close with a satisfying click, locking from the outside, because nothing says safety like being sealed into a high-speed box with a complete stranger and no exit strategy. But that's the charm of the railway, isn't it? Progress, velocity, death traps with velvet cushions. You shift slightly, adjusting your cane, your hat, your delusions. The carriage is peaceful. Too peaceful. You begin to wonder if anyone actually knows you're in here. And if someone were to, say, bludgeon you in the head and chuck your body onto the tracks like an overcooked roast, well, would anyone even notice? Of course not. You're in the future now, a modern man. And if there's one thing you know for certain, it's that murder is the sort of thing that only happens to other people. By the middle of the 19th century, Britain was utterly, almost irrationally in love with trains. They were fast, efficient, and best of all, they adhered to railway time, a grand invention in which the universe, for the first time in recorded history, was expected to revolve around the needs of British commuters. Gone were the muddy roads and the rickety stagecoaches. Now you could traverse entire counties without getting your boots dusty. The Liverpool and Manchester Railway launched in 1830 with the goal of hauling freight. But when humans realised they could be transported twice as fast for half the price, the trains filled up with people hungry for speed, opportunity, or possibly just a new place to be disappointed. By the 1860s, the country was webbed with 5,000 miles of railway track. Mountains were sliced open, valleys were bridged, time was standardised. The Industrial Revolution, already jittery on coal and ambition, found its favourite stimulant in steam. This wasn't just travel, it was transformation, and it ran on iron. But naturally, because this is Britain, euphoria was quickly followed by existential dread. The Victorians, being Victorians, had questions, troubling ones. Would 50 miles per hour cause your organs to collapse? Could your morals survive being seated next to someone from a lower tax bracket? Was it truly safe for ladies of delicate constitution to be trapped in a sealed compartment with someone who looked like they'd eaten cold meat with their fingers? Because while the train might deliver you to your destination in record time, it could also deliver you into the company of anyone. And that, far more than derailment or steam-powered organ failure, was the true horror. Compartmentalised travel had its charm, if by charm you mean absolutely no way to escape. Carriages had no corridors, no alarms, and no way to signal danger unless you fancied yelling through several inches of oak panelling. Once those doors clicked shut, you could be seated beside a fine upstanding gentleman, or someone who had just purchased a heavy cane with a curious interest in skulls. And therein lay the issue. The railway was meant to elevate Britain, but it also managed to democratise one very ancient profession: murder. As one contemporary newspaper put it would seem the modern marvel has also become a refuge for the villain. Indeed, because what the railway giveth in mobility and modernisation, it also taketh away in personal safety, especially for the wealthy, especially when seated alone, especially if they had the audacity to wear an expensive watch in plain sight. And so the Victorian train became more than just a symbol of progress. It became a moving stage where ambition, class tension, and poorly timed bludgeonings all came to a screeching climax at 17 miles per hour. It was only a matter of time before someone tested the limits of that velvet-lined coffin, and soon someone would. A banker, a beaver hat, and a crime so shocking it would derail the nation's sense of safety. For good. You board the train like the Victorian gentleman you were raised to be. Buttoned waistcoat, polished boots, and the kind of moustache that announces to the world, I am both important and terrible in emergencies. You've got your top hat tilted at a rakish angle, your gold watch tucked snugly in your vest, and absolutely no suspicion that you're about to be used as evidence in a murder investigation. The compartment is first class, of course. You wouldn't be caught dead in second class. Unfortunately, you're about to be caught dead in first. You settle in, nod politely at no one, and watch the countryside begin to blur. The doors lock with a satisfying click. Satisfying, that is, until you remember they only open from the outside. There is no corridor, no call bell, no means of escape unless you fancy diving headfirst into a hedgerow at 30 miles an hour. But you're not worried. You are a man of standing. You wear tailored trousers and carry a walking stick for reasons unrelated to walking. The very idea that someone might attack you, in broad daylight, on the North London Railway, is laughable, until it isn't. Until you realise there's a damp, coppery smell wafting from the other end of the seat. Until your compartment becomes suspiciously quiet. Until someone notices your cane is on the floor, your bag is missing, and your top hat has been swapped out for something a bit more budget-conscious. And just like that, you've gone from esteemed banker to bloodied plot device in the next day's headlines. Not that you'll get to read them. You're now part of the upholstery. On the evening of July 9th, 1864, Mr. Thomas Briggs, a 69-year-old banker and impeccably respectable Victorian man, boarded a first-class carriage from Fenchurch Street Station, heading home to Hackney. He was wearing a silk top hat, carrying a black leather bag, and almost certainly thinking about dinner. He never made it. Later that evening, 2 other passengers climbed into a different first-class compartment and noticed something strange. Blood. A lot of it. Smeared across the walls, staining the cushions, pooled on the floor. Also left behind, a cane with an ivory handle, an empty leather bag and a crumpled top hat that looked like it cost 12 pence and a bad decision. But there was no body, and no attacker. Just a sealed compartment that had become a Victorian crime scene on wheels. A few miles down the line, a railway driver spotted a twisted, motionless form lying between the tracks. It was Thomas Briggs, barely alive, skull shattered, ear nearly severed, beard soaked in blood. They dragged him to a nearby pub, naturally, summoned a doctor, and tried to make sense of what had happened. He died the following night without ever regaining consciousness. The public, meanwhile, lost its collective mind, because this wasn't just any murder. This was the first ever murder on a British train, in a sealed, locked first-class compartment, where no one saw or heard a thing. A place meant for calm, class-appropriate silence had suddenly become a blood-slicked crime box. Briggs wasn't just a banker, he was Victorian respectability personified. Middle-class, well-dressed, silver-haired, predictable. He was the kind of man who owned more than one umbrella and paid full price for cheese. If a man like him could be murdered mid-commute, what hope was there for the rest of society? Scotland Yard assigned a young and promising detective to the case, Inspector Richard Tanner. His job? Solve the first railway murder in history with no CCTV, no fingerprints, no witnesses, and the only clue being a tragically unfashionable hat. Luckily, that hat was a goldmine of embarrassment. Briggs's family said it absolutely did not belong to him. He purchased real hats from a city hatter for £1 apiece. The crumpled one left behind was cheap, worn, and decidedly not up to the standards of a man who carried a cane topped with ivory. Find the man who wore that disgrace of a hat, and you'd find the killer. Then came the next break. Briggs's gold watch chain had been stolen. A few days later, a jeweller named John Death, yes, his actual name, reported that a young man with a foreign accent had recently traded in a heavy old-fashioned chain for a cheaper one, and a signet ring. He'd acted strangely, shifting around to avoid being seen clearly, and the box he'd used to carry the new items had the jeweller's shop name stamped on the lid. Subtle. Eventually, a hackney cab driver came forward. He recognised the box. It had been left with his daughter by a young German friend named Franz Müller, a tailor, 23 years old, and perhaps not coincidentally a man known to be quite fond of a black beaver hat. Müller had just paid the cabbie a visit, to say goodbye. He was sailing to America, so now Scotland Yard had a name, a description, a motive, a timeline, and a distinct lack of a suspect. Because Müller, murderer or not, was already halfway across the Atlantic, and Detective Tanner, he was about to find himself on a ship of his own, crossing an ocean to arrest a man based entirely on a bad hat and a worse life choice. You are Franz Müller, a 23-year-old German tailor with big dreams, small morals, and a truly catastrophic sense of subtlety. You've just committed what you believe is the perfect murder, and by perfect, you mean you left your own hat at the crime scene, sold the victim's pocket watch to a man literally named Mr. Death, and fled the country under your real name. Smooth. Still, you're feeling rather pleased with yourself. You bludgeoned a banker in a locked train compartment, made off with his valuables, and now you're standing in a London jewellery shop, trading in the evidence like it's a clearance sale. You think the hat swap was genius. No one could possibly recognise you now, because nothing throws off an investigation like budget millinery and a foreign accent. You even hand the stolen watch chain to the jeweller in a branded box. A branded box, Franz, with the shop's name on it. You might as well have written "from the desk of the murderer" in gold leaf and included your forwarding address. Then, because you're clearly on a roll, you give that box to your landlord's daughter, as a gift, as a memento of your crime spree, as a little something to remember you by, before you hop on a steamship to New York and vanish forever, or at least until Scotland Yard shows up in a faster boat with an arrest warrant and a strong sense of irony. You've got 6 days before they realise what you've done, and you're spending them acting suspicious, loitering near piers, and creating the Victorian equivalent of a trail of breadcrumbs made entirely of red flags. Congratulations, Franz. You're now Europe's least competent fugitive, but at least you've got a nice new hat. While the British public reeled from the brutal murder of Thomas Briggs, Scotland Yard was already hard at work. Chief among them was Inspector Richard Tanner, who quickly became the bloodhound of the case. Thanks to witness statements, they traced Briggs' missing watch chain to Mr. John Death, a jeweller with a name better suited to the crime section than retail. Mr. Death reported that a young foreign-sounding man had recently visited his shop to swap an old gold chain and ring for newer ones. The visitor had seemed nervous. He gave a false name, and brilliantly, he put the new items in a box clearly marked with the shop's branding, the Victorian equivalent of committing murder, and then handing out personalised calling cards. Another thread came from a cabman named Matthews, who said his daughter had received that very box as a gift from a boarder, a German tailor named Franz Müller. And oh, what a coincidence! Müller had just packed up, said goodbye, and vanished onto a steamship bound for New York. The timeline was tight. The murder occurred on July 9th. Müller sailed for America on July 14th, aboard the SS Victoria, travelling under his real name, which again raises the question, was Müller hoping to escape unnoticed, or was he simply unaware that criminal mastermind is not a title you earn by leaving your hat at a crime scene? Still, the authorities moved quickly. A warrant was issued. Scotland Yard sent a telegram to New York requesting cooperation from American police. And most critically, Inspector Tanner himself boarded the much faster steamer City of Manchester, racing across the Atlantic to intercept Müller before he could vanish into the anonymity of the American working class. The case became a transatlantic sensation. Newspapers followed Tanner's every move. Illustrations of Müller's face, sometimes wildly inaccurate, circulated in both countries. Headlines shrieked about the railway horror, the German fugitive, and the hat that betrayed a killer. The British public, already primed by decades of true crime in penny dreadfuls and serialised newspapers, treated the chase like a national sport. Müller became a household name, a villain in the public imagination, and a symbol of everything terrifying about modern travel. Strangers, foreigners, and the inability to unlock your own train compartment while being quietly bludgeoned. By the time Müller stepped off the ship in New York, his face was on posters, his name was in the papers, and his return voyage was already being booked for prison. You're Inspector Richard Tanner, Scotland Yard's finest export since cholera, and you've just been told that the suspect in Britain's first railway murder has fled to America, because of course he has. Murder isn't inconvenient enough unless it also comes with international shipping. The man you're chasing is Franz Müller, a 23-year-old tailor with the intelligence of a teacup and the criminal subtlety of a brick through a bakery window. He left behind a hat, pawned the victim's watch to a man named Mr. Death, and gifted the incriminating box to a child. It's less a getaway and more a historical comedy of errors with blood. Now it's your job to catch him, not just because you're a detective, but because you have a deep and personal vendetta against sloppy criminals and missed train connections. You board the City of Manchester, a faster, sleeker steamer than Müller's rust bucket. He's already 5 days ahead, but that's fine. You have speed, a warrant, and a moral superiority so dense it could dent iron. The newspapers are all over you. You're on the front page looking very serious in a sketch that only vaguely resembles your face. The public is cheering for you like you're Queen Victoria's personal assassin. You enjoy the attention, of course. It's not every day you get to be the dashing lead in a transatlantic murder opera, complete with exotic villains and hats that should never have been worn in public. You spend the voyage reviewing your notes, sipping aggressively mediocre tea, and imagining the look on Müller's face when you show up in New York like the world's angriest postman, with a return address stamped Scotland Yard. He thinks he's escaped justice. You're here to remind him that British bureaucracy, when properly caffeinated, is faster than guilt. You arrive in New York with one goal: ruin this man's week, and possibly his life. In August 1864, Inspector Tanner boarded the SS City of Manchester, a ship that sailed significantly faster than Müller's SS Victoria, which had departed 5 days earlier. It was one of the first times in British history that a detective was dispatched internationally to apprehend a suspect. The press treated it like the Victorian Olympics, except with more blood, more hats, and significantly more public excitement. Tanner's arrival in New York was timed nearly perfectly. Müller had only just arrived himself, assuming, wrongly, that a few thousand miles of ocean would be enough to hide behind. He rented a room, wandered around the city, and generally behaved like a man who believed his problems were now floating somewhere behind him. Unfortunately for him, they were not. Tanner worked with NYPD detectives, who quickly tracked Müller down in Hoboken, New Jersey, at the home of a fellow German tailor. The arrest was swift. Müller was found wearing Briggs's gold watch, still ticking and carrying other incriminating items in his luggage. He did not put up much of a fight, possibly because it was now painfully obvious that he was not good at this. The newspapers on both sides of the Atlantic devoured the story. British readers were thrilled. The murderer had been caught, the chase had been won, and best of all, a British detective had outwitted an international fugitive, which was always a good day for imperial morale. However, the extradition wasn't automatic. Müller's defence tried to stall, citing a lack of hard evidence and appealing to local sympathies. There were anti-British sentiments in America at the time. After all, the Civil War had only just ended, and some newspapers questioned whether the UK had the right to demand Müller's return. But after nearly 2 months of legal back and forth, US President Abraham Lincoln himself signed the extradition order. He was assassinated less than a year later, but probably not by a disgruntled tailor. Müller was shipped back to England in September 1864, under armed guard and constant watch by a triumphant tanner. By the time they docked, the press had already written Müller into history as a villain, and Tanner as the man who crossed oceans to bring British justice to a velvet-lined train compartment. The only thing left now was to put Müller on trial. The press was salivating. The public was furious. And Müller? He was still trying to explain that hat. You are Franz Müller. And somehow, despite the murder, the stolen watch, the box with your name on it, and the international manhunt, you're still a little surprised to find yourself under arrest. After all, you left Britain like a gentleman, hatless, clueless, and bleeding plausible deniability. Now here you are, standing in a New York boarding house, blinking at the police like they've just interrupted your holiday. Which technically, they have. You were planning to start a new life in America, tailoring by day, avoiding newspapers by night, until Scotland Yard showed up like the worst kind of pen pal, punctual and carrying shackles. They say you were wearing the dead man's gold watch when they found you. You don't remember that part. You've also forgotten how the stolen items ended up in your luggage, how your own hat ended up at the crime scene, and how Mr. Death the jeweller became the most credible witness in your defence. Your extradition isn't just swift, it's presidential. Yes, the actual Abraham Lincoln signs off on shipping you back across the Atlantic like a defective product. You are officially internationally unwanted. The return voyage is less relaxing than the first. There's no hope of escape, no complimentary fruit, and no misunderstanding about what happens when the ship docks in Britain. You're going to court, then you're going to the gallows, and you're starting to suspect that hat swap didn't work out the way you hoped. Franz Müller was arrested in New York on August 25, 1864, just days after Inspector Tanner arrived. He was found at the home of another German tailor, in possession of Thomas Briggs' gold watch and several damning personal effects. While the newspapers erupted with headlines, Müller remained calm, possibly because he hadn't yet realised how thoroughly his goose had been cooked. After weeks of legal wrangling, extradition was approved, personally by President Abraham Lincoln, which must have added a whole extra sting to the trip home. It's not every day the leader of the free world signs your permission slip for hanging. Müller was escorted back across the Atlantic aboard the USS Deerhound, guarded day and night. By the time he returned to Britain, he wasn't just a suspect, he was a full-blown media sensation. Crowds gathered at every stop to catch a glimpse of the railway murderer. Children waved handkerchiefs and newspapers sold out on the back of his name alone. It was like Beatlemania, but with more execution. His trial began at the Old Bailey on October 25, 1864, and lasted just 4 days. The evidence was damning. The stolen watch, the hat swap, the jewellery exchange with Mr. Death, and the rather unfortunate box handed to the cabman's daughter like a murder-themed party favour. Müller claimed innocence. He said he'd purchased the watch chain legally, had nothing to do with the murder, and had simply found the items in question. The jury didn't buy it. The trial ended with a unanimous guilty verdict, and Müller was sentenced to death by hanging. He reportedly fainted when the sentence was read, although this may have been the most sensible thing he'd done all year. On November 14, 1864, Müller was executed at Newgate Prison before a crowd estimated at 50,000 people. Victorians, you see, loved a good hanging. Entire families came out, vendors sold snacks, and newspapers published lurid illustrations of the gallows. It was part civic duty, part social outing, and entirely disturbing. As for the hat, the most infamous piece of headwear in British legal history, it was reportedly placed on display at Scotland Yard for years. A cautionary tale in felt and failure. But the tracks weren't done running red, because 17 years later another gentleman boarded a train with delusions of grandeur, and left a man dead in a tunnel. The ink had barely dried on the last confession when another name joined the passenger list to hell. This time, it was June 27th, 1881. A man in evening clothes boarded a train to Brighton carrying a revolver, 2 spare hats, and a fantasy life far more lethal than reality. You are Percy Lefroy Mapleton, a 19-year-old opera critic with no money, no plan, and no discernible grip on reality. You've written exactly 1 article and decided you're a literary prodigy. You've seen an actress perform once and decided you're soulmates. You've been broke for weeks and decided that murder is your new business model. Today you've boarded a train bound for Brighton with 2 hats, a revolver, and the kind of reckless delusion that can only be described as lethal confidence. You're sitting across from a quiet, unremarkable man named Frederick Gold. But in your mind, you're the tragic anti-hero in some romantic penny dreadful. You're dramatic. You're mysterious. You're bleeding from your own staged injuries and demanding attention, like the world is your personal audience. After stabbing and shooting Gold to death, you fling his body out of the train like discarded scenery and march straight into the station office, covered in blood, missing a hat, and claiming you were randomly attacked by invisible men. You don't explain why you're holding the dead man's bag. You don't explain the revolver. You just ask for a newspaper, because that's what you do when you've committed a murder and still think this might be your big break in publishing. Your entire story is held together with delusion, sweat, and the hope that no one at the station has basic pattern recognition. You're bleeding, twitching, contradicting yourself in every sentence, and still somehow think you're pulling this off. You aren't. But don't worry, Percy, you'll get your headline, just not the one you wanted. On June 27th, 1881, Percy Lefroy Mapleton boarded the London to Brighton train, seated in the same compartment as Frederick Isaac Gold, a 64-year-old retired messenger. Mapleton was a known eccentric, broke, unemployed, and pathologically dramatic. He had written a few opera critiques, convinced himself he was a theatrical genius, and told his landlady he was engaged to the actress Violet Cameron, whom he had never actually met. Gold never made it off the train alive. Somewhere in a dark railway tunnel, Mapleton shot and stabbed Gold repeatedly before throwing his body from the moving train. When Mapleton arrived at the next station, he was bleeding from superficial wounds, missing a hat, and spinning a tale of being attacked by mysterious assailants who apparently vanished into thin air without bothering to kill him properly. The station staff were immediately suspicious. Mapleton's story didn't match his injuries. His clothes were stained with blood. And most damning of all, he was carrying a bag that belonged to Gold, who was soon discovered dead on the tracks between stations. The police allowed him to leave temporarily, under the pretense of medical treatment, but he vanished into London instead. A nationwide manhunt began, and this case would become the first in British history to use a composite sketch published in newspapers to identify a fugitive. The public devoured the story. The press dubbed him the Railway Murderer, and the sketch was reprinted everywhere. Landladies, barbers, and cab drivers across England were suddenly experts in facial recognition. One paper wrote, "He wears evening dress and silk hats, carries a cane, and affects a gentlemanly air which he cannot sustain for more than 5 minutes." A hotel clerk later claimed Mapleton had offered him a gold watch to burn a suspicious valise. Another woman said he'd asked her to dye his hair. A milkman, rather nobly, attempted to tackle him outside a pub. Mapleton was eventually arrested 8 days later at Stepney Green, hiding out under a false name. The police noted that he was reading articles about himself when they knocked on the door. And yes, he asked for a newspaper on the way to the station, but Mapleton's greatest performance was still to come, a courtroom drama starring himself, a murder charge, and a wildly misguided plea for sympathy. You are Percy Lefroy Mapleton, Britain's most wanted man, and you're currently hiding in London like a gothic drama queen who's lost both his script and his mind. You've murdered a man, tossed him from a moving train, and your best alibi was, "A group of strangers attacked me in a locked compartment and politely left without stealing anything." It's been 8 days. You've dyed your hair, you've changed your name, you've spent an alarming amount of time reading newspaper articles about yourself. There's a sketch of your face on every street corner, and you're still strolling around like the protagonist in a story you can't stop narrating. The worst part? You think you're pulling it off. You talk to landladies with fake names. You trade gold watches for silence. You ask strangers to burn your luggage, which is, by the way, the least suspicious thing anyone has ever done in Victorian London. You're wearing disguises that don't work and telling lies that unravel on contact. The entire country is looking for you. A milkman tried to tackle you. A barber refused to cut your hair in case it made him an accessory. You're not famous, you're infamous, and no one's buying what you're selling. Then one evening there's a knock at the door. You open it, wearing your best not a murderer face. The man standing outside just tips his hat and says, "That'll do, Mr. Mapleton. You've been caught, and you forgot to change your shoes." The manhunt for Percy Lefroy Mapleton quickly became one of the most sensational chases in British criminal history. It was the first time a composite police sketch was published in newspapers to help catch a fugitive. It worked spectacularly. The drawing, printed in papers across the country, showed a thin, pale young man with sharp features and too much attitude. Within days, sightings were pouring in. People claimed to see him everywhere. Train stations, theatres, pubs, and occasionally in places he very much was not. But Mapleton, he hadn't fled the country. He'd simply changed his name and was hiding in Stepney, bouncing between cheap lodging houses, growing increasingly paranoid, and reading about himself with a mixture of fascination and narcissism. One particularly telling moment came when he asked a woman to burn a suspicious valise, presumably filled with evidence. When she hesitated, he offered her a gold watch. Unfortunately for him, this only made her more suspicious, and she reported the interaction to police. Meanwhile, public fascination reached absurd levels. The Daily Telegraph called him a demon in evening dress. Street vendors sold handbills about the murder, and working-class readers, already suspicious of dandies and silk hats, took Mapleton as proof that anyone could be a killer, especially if they wore cologne. Mapleton was finally tracked to a boarding house by a Scotland Yard detective who noticed a guest matching the sketch, reading a newspaper with his own face in it. He was arrested without resistance. Police noted that he appeared startled, then embarrassed, then resigned. In other words, the full Percy Lefroy Mapleton emotional cycle. On his way to the station, he was recognised by a passing boy who shouted, "That's the railway murderer. I'd know that nose anywhere." It was not, as they say, his best day, but Mapleton's final act was yet to come, a courtroom performance so theatrical, so self-pitying, and so thoroughly unbelievable, it might have won applause, if it hadn't ended in a death sentence. "You are Percy Lefroy Mapleton, failed opera critic, mediocre liar, and now, unwilling star of the most popular show in London, your own murder trial. You've got nothing left but a cravat, a wildly ineffective alibi, and a sincere belief that crying in court will somehow undo a bullet to the chest and a body tossed from a moving train. You enter the courtroom like it's opening night. You've rehearsed this. You've practiced your mournful glances. You've chosen a waistcoat that screams gentleman in distress, and you've prepared at least 3 different poses to highlight your suffering. Unfortunately, the jury looks like they've already read the reviews. You tell them you were attacked by shadowy figures. No names, no witnesses, no footprints, no blood, and no motive. Just some random train phantoms who mugged you, stabbed a stranger, and vanished into the steam like criminal poltergeists. You insist that you were also a victim, a sensitive, misunderstood artist, a poet, a man of depth, a man who just happened to be drenched in someone else's blood and holding their luggage. Coincidence, obviously. The prosecution doesn't even break a sweat. The evidence is stacked like railway luggage. You don't help your case by sighing dramatically or correcting the pronunciation of your own name in the middle of testimony. The press is eating it up. Railway murderer melts down in court. Percy and the Phantom Killers. Witless in silk. A dandy's descent. You realise too late that you're not the hero of this story. You're not even the villain. You're comic relief with a death sentence. And when the guilty verdict comes in, you drop like a Victorian fainting couch just lost its lease. Percy Lefroy Mapleton's trial began on July 18th, 1881, and quickly turned into the Victorian equivalent of a three-act tragedy, except no one bought the lead's performance. The prosecution laid out the evidence. Mapleton was seen boarding the train with Frederick Gold. He arrived blooded and hatless, carrying Gold's belongings. The revolver used in the murder was traced back to him. He claimed to be attacked by multiple invisible men. The defence argued, well, not much. They suggested Mapleton had been assaulted, but couldn't explain why he still had the victim's property, or why the wounds he described didn't match his story. They also emphasised that Percy was sensitive and artistic, which apparently the jury didn't find legally compelling. The press described him as pale, thin, and visibly nervous, alternating between self-pity and baffling confidence. He requested books to read in his holding cell. He corrected quotes printed in the newspaper. At one point he complained about the quality of the illustrations used in his arrest coverage. The public, meanwhile, had already decided this was not a man to be pitied. This was a man to be executed. The jury took just 10 minutes to return a guilty verdict. Mapleton was sentenced to death by hanging. He reportedly collapsed in the dock and had to be carried out of the courtroom. Even in defeat, he insisted he was misunderstood, a poor, desperate youth driven to madness by poverty and heartbreak. The judge did not agree. Neither did the crowd waiting outside. And so, the curtain rises on Percy's final act. An early morning execution with a full crowd, a trembling prisoner, and the end of a delusion that started with opera reviews and ended at the gallows. You are Percy Lefroy Mapleton, failed writer, botched murderer, and now unwilling main character in Britain's latest must-see public event. You always wanted to make headlines, Percy. You just didn't expect they'd be printed next to a meat pie cart at your own execution. It's dawn at Newgate Prison, and outside the gates 50,000 people have gathered to watch you die. Some arrive before sunrise, some brought their children, some are already arguing about who has the best view of your neck. You, meanwhile, are being handed a white cap and reminded, politely but firmly, not to vomit on the hangman. You'd hoped for something quieter, maybe a poetic farewell, a moody monologue, one last brooding stare into the fog, but alas, your ending is more slapstick tragedy than Shakespearean exit. You can barely hold it together long enough to mumble a final statement. I am guilty, but not as bad as they say. Charming. The priest reads something solemn. The hangman adjusts the rope like he's tightening the drawstring on a sack of potatoes. You wobble forward, legs like boiled noodles, and glance once, just once, at the massive crowd craning their necks for a better view of your worst moment. You wanted fame, Percy. You got it. You just didn't realise your most successful performance would involve trapdoors and gravity. And then, with all the grace of a theatrical flop, you drop. On November 29th, 1881, Percy Lefroy Mapleton was hanged at Newgate Prison for the murder of Frederick Isaac Gold. His execution was a massive public event, attended by tens of thousands of curious onlookers. It was quite literally standing room only. This was one of the last public executions in British history, and it was exactly the kind of grisly spectacle Victorian Londoners adored. Vendors sold sweets and meat pies. Children sat on their parents' shoulders. Entrepreneurs handed out printed ballads with titles like The Tragic Fate of the Railway Dandy. It was part carnival, part civic duty, all nightmare. Mapleton, who had spent the weeks leading up to his hanging reading newspapers about himself, was reportedly visibly distressed as the moment approached. He asked to be buried in consecrated ground. He gave a brief confession, admitting to guilt but still painting himself as a misunderstood man caught in desperation. The press predictably had a field day. Papers described his final moments in vivid, sometimes embellished detail. Some called him pitiful. Others mocked his vanity. One obituary noted dryly, his career as a writer was brief, and his impact on the arts negligible. His impact on the rails, however, was rather more enduring. After his execution, the public debate turned toward the safety of railway compartments. Mapleton's case, like that of Thomas Briggs years earlier, once again reminded Victorians that locking passengers alone in tiny moving boxes with strangers was, perhaps, not the pinnacle of industrial progress. It also marked a cultural shift. This case was one of the first where the press, public opinion and police sketches all collided into a media frenzy that shaped the fate of a man before he ever set foot in court. Mapleton, of course, would have been thrilled by the attention. Shame he wasn't around to read the reviews. One murderer swung, the crowd cheered, and for a brief moment, Victorian train compartments smelled only of dust and cigars again. But peace, like punctual trains, never lasted long. It was now June 13th, 1897. Another man boarded a train, another banker didn't get off. Your John Owen, travelling salesman, connoisseur of overcooked train pies, and the unlucky bloke who just found himself in a murder compartment. You were hoping for a quiet journey with some light newspaper reading, maybe a discreet nap, possibly a digestive emergency depending on lunch. Instead, you've become the unwilling co-star in a bloody crime scene. It starts with a smell. Not the usual Victorian medley of smoke, damp wool and casual hygiene neglect. No, this is something else. Metallic, sharp, like someone forgot to clean up after murdering a banker. You glance at the man slumped across from you. He hasn't moved in a while, which is fine, because most Victorian men spend entire train rides pretending their seatmate doesn't exist. But this one seems really committed to the bit. He's not breathing or blinking, and there's blood pooling under his hat. You give him a nudge, hoping he's just drunk. He flops like a sack of potatoes in a three-piece suit. You sit there for a moment, blinking at the corpse like it owes you an apology. Then you stand, step over the blood puddle, and calmly report the incident in the most British way possible. "Excuse me, there appears to be a dead gentleman in my compartment." No screaming, no hysteria, just mild inconvenience. Because after all, this is a Victorian train, and the only thing more common than delays is bludgeoned upper management. On June 13th, 1897, the body of William Terrace Gibbs, a well-dressed gentleman in his 50s, was discovered in a second-class compartment of the London to Brighton train. He had been brutally assaulted, his skull fractured, his head bloodied, his face partially covered with a handkerchief, as if someone had lost their nerve halfway through a polite cover-up. Early reports described the scene as disorderly, with luggage rifled through and personal belongings scattered. There was no immediate sign of the attacker. Gibbs had boarded the train at London Bridge and was expected in Brighton but never arrived. His fellow passengers, those who shared adjacent compartments, claimed to have heard nothing unusual. One man, however, John Owen, claimed to smell something strange, which led to the discovery of the body. The murder immediately echoed the infamous Thomas Briggs case from decades earlier. Same train line, same type of sealed compartment, same question. How can someone be killed on a moving train without anyone noticing? The public, of course, was captivated. Newspapers ran headlines like, "Another railway horror, gentleman murdered in transit, death in the tunnel, train mystery deepens." Investigators quickly focused on a few key details. The victim had not been robbed. His valuables were intact. His face was covered post-mortem, a possible sign of remorse or ritual. A witness claimed to have seen a suspicious man disembark at Purley Station, hurrying away on foot. The trail led detectives to a former soldier named George Parker, who had once worked with the victim and allegedly bore a grudge over a business dispute. Parker was eventually found in a seaside lodging house, blood-stained shirt hidden in the fireplace, travel bag still packed. He denied everything, of course, claimed he hadn't seen Gibbs in years, said the blood was from a shaving accident. The police, remarkably, did not believe him. As the trial approached, the public leaned in once more. Another locked compartment mystery, another allegedly respectable man accused of murder, and another reminder that no matter how nice the upholstery is, you're still just one bad decision from becoming railway decor. You're George Parker, ex-soldier, occasional grudge holder, and now defendant in a murder trial that's going downhill faster than a runaway coal train. You're in court, wearing your least bloody waistcoat, trying very hard to look like someone who wouldn't kill a man in a railway tunnel. It's not going well. You claim you haven't seen the victim in years. The prosecution says otherwise. Your landlady says otherwise. Your shirt, last seen smouldering in her fireplace, says otherwise in all caps. But you've got explanations. Oh, you've got explanations. The blood, from shaving, the missing clothes, a laundry mishap, the burned garments. You were cold in June, during a heat wave. After someone found your former boss dead with his face rearranged, you try to keep your story straight, but the moment they show you a photo of the victim, you blink like someone trying to recognise a co-worker you definitely punched last Christmas. Never seen him before, you mumble, while every juror simultaneously raises an eyebrow so high it enters another tax bracket. The defence tries their best. They say you're being railroaded. Irony is not their strong suit. The press, of course, loves it. Ex-soldier on trial in tunnel slaying, bloody beards and burned baggage, murderer or just a very aggressive shaver. Outside, people are placing bets on how fast the jury will reach a verdict. Inside, you're sweating through your collar and regretting every career decision that led to this moment, including your choice of victim, compartment, and post-murder laundry strategy. You wanted closure. You're getting rope. The trial of George Parker began in late 1897 and quickly became another railway murder sensation. The victim, William Terrace Gibbs, had been killed in a second-class train compartment under suspiciously quiet circumstances. Parker, a former colleague with a history of violent disagreements, was arrested at a Brighton lodging house shortly after the murder. The prosecution's case was built on eyewitness testimony from a station porter who saw Parker disembarking in a hurry, burned clothing which the landlady testified Parker had destroyed the same night as, the murder. Parker's own conflicting stories, which changed depending on how much pressure was, applied a suspicious lack of explanation for blood found on his belongings. The defence, such as it was, tried to paint Parker as misunderstood, stressed, and perhaps unfairly targeted. The shaving cut defence was floated again, because if it was good enough for Victorian barbershop disasters, it was good enough for court. Unfortunately, the jury wasn't buying it. Parker showed little emotion during the trial, except for occasional confusion when questioned directly. One reporter noted, "The accused looked alternately irritated and bored, as if the entire trial were a minor inconvenience he hoped would resolve itself." The jury returned a guilty verdict, and Parker was sentenced to hang. Unlike Mapleton, he did not faint or beg for mercy. He reportedly nodded once, sat down, and waited. He was executed in early 1898, in one of the last high-profile railway murder hangings of the Victorian era. The case added one final bloody notch to Britain's uneasy relationship with its beloved railway system. Trains were progress, trains were speed, trains were how gentlemen got bludgeoned in style. Another killer hanged, another newspaper sold, and for a fleeting moment, British train compartments returned to their natural state, just moderately horrifying. But then came July 8th, 1899. A man boarded a train with his briefcase, his bowler hat, and his life in order. Only one of those would make it to the end of the journey. Your Donald Fraser, railway porter, overworked, underpaid, and precisely one corpse away from quitting this job and taking up something less stressful, like lion taming. You're walking the length of the train, checking compartments, pretending you're not developing trench foot in your shoes, when you reach carriage 47. You knock on the door, no answer, fine. Victorian men aren't known for being chatty. Maybe he's sleeping. Maybe he's unconscious from the gin. Maybe he's ignoring you, because acknowledging porters is frowned upon by people who own more than one pair of gloves. You knock again. Still nothing. Then the smell hits you. It's not cigar smoke. It's not old socks. It's not whatever unspeakable cheese was in the buffet car. This is metallic, warm, and distressingly murdery. You open the compartment. Inside, a man is slumped forward, his head partially caved in, and his blood politely soaking into the upholstery like it paid for first class. You stand there, blinking at the scene, wondering what part of your job description covers cleaning up blunt force trauma. There's no murder weapon, no signs of a struggle, just a smashed window and a body that looks like it lost a bar fight with Satan. You take a long, deep breath. You straighten your cap, you sigh the sigh of a man who has absolutely had it with this railway, and you say, very calmly, the sentence no porter ever wants to repeat, "We've got another one." The victim was Henry Dargent, a 42-year-old clerk who had boarded the train from London to Bexhill in the early afternoon. He was described by friends as punctual, reserved, and not the type to start trouble, which in 1899 usually meant you had at least a 50-50 chance of surviving public transportation. He was found bludgeoned to death in a locked compartment, his briefcase untouched, his wallet full, and no obvious enemies in his life. There was no motive, no witnesses, no signs of forced entry. The only clue was a smashed window, which investigators theorised might have been used as an escape route, or possibly just broken during the struggle. The newspapers had a field day. Another railway mystery. Blood on the line. Killer vanishes into smoke. The invisible assailant of carriage 47. Every theory imaginable was printed. A vagrant slipped into the compartment and fled mid-journey. The killer was a disgruntled co-worker who exited at a stop before the body was found. A secret affair gone wrong. A murder-for-hire scheme involving rival clerks. Unlikely but dramatic. One paper even suggested Dargent may have killed himself in a way that involved precisely bludgeoning the back of his own skull, then arranging his body like a murder scene before dying. Victorians loved a twist. Despite nationwide coverage, no suspect was ever arrested, and the case quietly faded into the fog. The official conclusion, unsolved. No fingerprints, no forensics, just a locked door, a broken window, and a body that reminded an entire country why private compartments were such a terrible idea in the first place. And so the story ends, not with a trial or a hanging, but with silence. One last mystery sealed behind velvet curtains, rattling over the rails into darkness. You are a respectable Victorian gentleman, or at least you were, until you opened your morning newspaper and discovered you are now statistically more likely to be murdered in a train compartment than bitten by a rabid badger. And that's saying something, because your cousin Timothy did die from a badger. You sit in your drawing room, tea in hand, toast untouched, staring at the latest cover of the Illustrated Police News, which seems determined to replace every ounce of blood in your body with pure, concentrated anxiety. The headline? Carriage carnage, banker bludgeoned beside Buffett car. Below it, a woodcut illustration of a man in a top hat getting absolutely walloped with what appears to be, is that a spade? No, it's a bootjack, or a flamingo. Honestly, the proportions are unclear, but the message is not. You're going to die the next time you sit near anyone wearing tweed. You scan the article for comfort. There is none. A businessman was found face down in a puddle of his own wealth. His only crime? Choosing first class. You clutch your cravat. You glare suspiciously at your butler. He knows you take the train to Brighton. You make a mental note to update your will and cancel your weekend travel plans. You will walk to Brighton if you must, or hire a donkey. You turn the page. Another murder. Another sketch of a corpse on railway upholstery that looks suspiciously like your own fainting couch. You close the paper. You sip your now tepid tea. You say, aloud, to no one in particular, I simply must stop reading before breakfast. But you won't, because the truth is, you love it. In the late 19th century, railway murder wasn't just news. It was front-page entertainment. The Victorian press, always hungry for readership, treated every crime like a serialised melodrama. The Illustrated Police News was a major culprit and delight. With its lurid engravings, dramatic captions, and complete disregard for subtlety, it turned every victim into a tragic hero and every murderer into a mustachioed villain. Some illustrations showed blood pouring like a faucet. Others depicted terrified ladies fainting in compartments that looked more like opera boxes than railway cars. Headlines included, Another horror on the lines, Murder in the tunnel, gentleman's face mashed. The railway reaper strikes again. If it sounds excessive, it was, but the public loved it. Sales soared every time a body was found in a carriage. Entire families devoured the stories over breakfast, discussing alibis, motives, and the structural weaknesses of railway door locks. Fear became fashion. Murder became a marketing strategy. Even the Times, the serious self-important paper of record, began covering train murders with just a hint more flair than usual, noting with dry horror the startling frequency of deaths under rail-bound circumstances. The press didn't just report the stories, they shaped them. Mapleton's trial wouldn't have been half as notorious without the now famous composite sketch, reprinted in dozens of papers. His fainting, his poetry, his bleeding nose, all of it became serialized content for an audience that couldn't get enough. Papers speculated wildly. Some floated conspiracy theories. Others invented motives entirely. One editor suggested that railway seats should be padded with iron to prevent murder, which is either brilliant satire or the worst design pitch ever submitted to British Rail. The panic spread to Parliament. Letters poured in demanding safer carriages, mirrors, panic cords, or at the very least public hangings with extra flair. One MP declared, "It is a scandal that Englishmen cannot travel without being murdered," to which a paper replied, "They rarely could before." And so, with every fresh corpse and screaming headline, the public lost a little more trust in the sanctity of first-class velvet. And the train, the proud symbol of British progress, became once again a rolling coffin with a timetable. You are Mr. Horace P. Blatherwick, Chief Safety Officer for the South Eastern Railway Company, and your office is currently on fire. Not literally, that would be easy. No, this is a paperwork fire, a rising inferno of newspaper clippings, angry letters, public demands, and one alarming illustration showing a train passenger being strangled with his own umbrella. Your morning begins with a strongly worded editorial titled, "How Many More Must Die in Cushioned Silence?" Below that, a diagram of a proposed decapitation-resistant door hinge, a letter from a duchess demanding a revolver with every ticket, and 3 separate requests for interviews about why your trains are murder tubes with velvet. Your supervisor wants solutions, Parliament wants answers, the public wants blood, unless it's theirs. And you want a nice lie-down in a compartment that hasn't recently contained a corpse. You shuffle to the mirror and say out loud, "All right, Horace, let's invent something." You settle on a bold safety strategy, a cord that can be pulled in emergencies. A tiny glass peephole in each compartment door, and sternly worded signage reminding passengers not to die unless absolutely necessary. You present your ideas to the board. They applaud. They sip brandy. Someone suggests offering gentlemen's helmets. You nod. The moment passes. You walk out of the meeting a hero, until the next murder. After a public avalanche of fear, rage, and very imaginative illustrations, British Railways finally responded to the growing pile of murder victims by installing the bare minimum in safety improvements. Here's what they came up with. The emergency communication cord. Pull it, and the guard might stop the train, or ignore it, or write you a fine for touching things. Glass spy panels, little windows in the doors so staff could peek into compartments, without knocking, effective mostly for spotting corpses after the fact. External door locks, meant to prevent entry during travel, did not prevent murder inside the compartment, but nice try. Warning placards. Report suspicious behaviour. Pull cord only in emergency. Murder strongly discouraged. Naturally, these improvements were not always used correctly. In one case, a passenger pulled the cord because his sandwich was too dry. In another, a woman triggered the emergency brake to retrieve a hat she'd thrown out the window by accident. One man pulled the cord, then admitted he just wanted to see what it did. Rail companies began issuing fines. The public responded with sarcasm and increased paranoia. One member of Parliament stood in Parliament and said, "It is a curious safety system that punishes one more for ringing a bell than for committing murder." Meanwhile, newspapers continued publishing headlines like, "Another death in carriage 14. Was the cord pulled? Safety window? Too late to look." Railway executives held more meetings. More tea was consumed. More cords were installed. And absolutely no one addressed the real issue. Perhaps locking strangers alone in tiny unmonitored compartments for hours at a time was not the ideal design for public transit. But change came slowly, because murder was scary, but train delays were scarier. And so, the Victorian Railway marched on, now equipped with flimsy cords, tiny windows and a growing list of passengers who learned the hard way that first class didn't mean last to die. You are you, modern, cosy, possibly horizontal. You're listening to a story about Victorian train murders while wearing pyjama pants made of synthetic fleece and sipping something that tastes like therapy in a mug. And yet, despite all logic, you're now imagining yourself stepping into a 19th century railway compartment where someone definitely dies every 3 to 5 business days. The air smells like cigar smoke, damp tweed and unresolved class tension. The seat cushions are velvet, probably blood absorbent. You sit across from a man with a moustache so serious it could testify in court. He gives you a polite nod. You nod back. Everyone's pretending this isn't weird. The door clicks shut, locks from the outside, and of course it does. There's no corridor, no panic button, no report passenger feature. Just you, Victorian moustache man, and the growing realization that if anything goes wrong, the best you can do is die politely and hope the newspaper gets your name right. The train jerks forward. He coughs. You flinch. He pulls out a newspaper. You flinch again. You remember every single chapter of this audiobook and suddenly regret every choice that brought you here, starting with your decision to be born at all. You glance at the door, then at the mustache, and then back at the door. But you're locked in now, and honestly, you've come this far. You lean back into the plush seat, fold your hands and whisper, "If I die in here, at least it'll make a great podcast." The Victorian train murder was never just about the death. It was about the setting, the compartment, the tunnel, the silence. It was a crime born from industrial progress, a nation hurtling toward modernity while locking people into tiny rooms with strangers and hoping for the best. These stories fascinated the public not just because they were gruesome, but because they revealed a hidden terror, that danger doesn't always wear a mask or carry a sign. Sometimes it wears a waistcoat, sits across from you and says nothing at all, and every murder changed something. Thomas Briggs gave us spy holes, Percy Lefroy Mapleton gave us press sketches and national manhunts, George Parker gave us bloodied alibis and broken excuses, and the unnamed final victim, he gave us a mystery we still haven't solved. The velvet seats grew thicker. The signage got sterner. Eventually the compartments gave way to open cars, corridors and surveillance. But something stayed behind. The unease, the whisper, the flicker of doubt when you share a space with someone you don't know. And maybe, just maybe, that's what made it so irresistible. Because history isn't just about what we've built, it's also about what we survived. And now, as the final door clicks shut and the last compartment disappears into the fog, I hope this absurd little journey through Victorian train murders lingers, like the smell of coal smoke and a very bad decision made in first class. You've survived blood-soaked upholstery, delusional dandies with revolvers, and enough suspicious moustaches to warrant their own inquest. But for now, it's time to rest. The train has pulled into the station, the suspects have been hanged or forgotten, and the porter has finally stopped finding bodies during his rounds. If you're still awake, impressive. You've just made it through history's most velvet-lined death trap. Hit subscribe so we can unlock another compartment of chaos tomorrow night, and as you drift, the soft crackle of the fire will carry you deeper, far from locked doors and whispering wheels, and into sleep.